r/ProRevenge. First story. Better check your facts, because people know people had to post this one. It isn't petty, it isn't regular, and it ruined a guy's journalistic career. The internet has evolved quite a lot over the years. Some people may remember Usenet groups. I know I do. Used to have a lot of fun reading them. Kind of similar in a way to today's Reddit in a way. No matter what the subject was, someone would have a Usenet newsgroup for it. But unlike today's Reddit, it was strictly text. You could download images, but they would take forever to download, and could often be across several different messages, just one of the messages missing, and you wouldn't get the image. Things then improved. Download speed slowly got faster, and then there was Ike that came about. Ike saw the same thing. There was chat room for anything and everything, and if there wasn't, you could clearly create it. If you were to try to watch a video over the internet back then, it could take you a couple of hours to download a music video. You get the idea. This is important for the context of the story. I was a writer on a couple of wrestling newsletters during the mid to late 90s. We only published our newsletters online. You could have it emailed to you, or go to a website to read it. Think we hosted on Geocities or Tripod. Both wrestling newsletters were independent of each other, and I used different nicknames on each. One was more a review and preview newsletter, where we would post reviews of the most recent shows/events, talk about current feuds, and talk about what we may think will happen in the next big event. The other newsletter was a news and rumors newsletter, with a few fun puzzles/competitions thrown in to keep things interesting. At the time, you had a few big name wrestling news and rumors websites, and a handful of small ones. I was a writer on one of the small ones. Sometimes we would get news and rumors from the big name websites, giving them credit where appropriate. Sometimes, we would hear things from people in the business. Everyone had their sources of information. And sometimes we would make an educated guess on possible scenarios, based on current trends in the industry. It did get a bit cutthroat at times, with some newsletters claiming that they broke the news first, when it had already been published in other newsletters first. And you would even have some newsletters devote all of their time trying to rubbish the other newsletters for publishing false and misleading information. It was rumors. We did not always get it right. Through a couple of readers of my first wrestling newsletter, I learned of a huge surprise in the works for one organization, which could potentially lead to something happening at a big event coming up. I won't mention the surprise, but it involved a person from another sport. No other wrestling newsletter had reported it, so I included it as a rumor on the second wrestling newsletter. I was instantly rubbished by one of the major wrestling newsletters at the time, publishing a clearly nonsense rumor that would never happen, only for that very same newsletter to publish the exact same rumor 2 or 3 days later and claim to be the first ones to publish it. This sort of stuff happened all the time. It did not bother me at all. Anyway, I happen to have a few wrestlers who actually read my first newsletter. No big names as such, but a couple of lesser known wrestlers in the big organizations. I knew who they were, but refused to reveal their identities back then, and refused to reveal them now. One of them let me know of an unknown fact from a major match a couple of years earlier. It was to do with an injury that happened during a part of the match. This fact had never been published anywhere else at the time. I mentioned that I wrote for another wrestling newsletter that dealt with news and rumors, and asked if I could repeat the information. The wrestler said sure, but not to credit him. So I go ahead and publish the rumor. Straight away I had another of the smaller wrestling newsletters say that it was nonsense. They said that it was impossible for the match to have continued had the injury happened. They then started a smear campaign on the second newsletter. I was getting spam emails constantly, virus attempts originating from the competition. The competition even went so far as claiming that they had the full story of my wife of 10 years working as a hooker. Don't ask. They were trying to find anything to smear me with. There was more sinister and disgusting stuff, but I won't write it here. Why it got so personal, I do not know, but the funny thing was that at the time, I was a 22-year-old single university student, and if I had a wife of 10 years who was working as a hooker, I would have had to marry her when I was 12. But his smear campaign was working. Our readership dropped by nearly 50%. It was time to get some revenge, although I had no idea just how far the revenge would end up reaching. Firstly, I approached one of the bigger wrestling newsletters. They would often run ads at the bottom or rear of their newsletters for affiliated newsletters. I organized a new affiliation with them, removing an affiliation they had with the competition. Small potatoes. I started promoting the second newsletter heavily on Usenet in some of the wrestling groups, which ultimately led to an increase in our email subscription base, greater than what it was before his smear campaign. This negated any effect that his smear campaign had, but I was hungry for more. I wanted to shove it where the sun don't shine, so I contacted those wrestlers who read my first newsletter. I explained the situation to them, and they were happy to help out. It took a couple of weeks, but eventually I was able to post a link to a 15-second video, hosted on a Geocities webpage, as well as on a wrestling Usenet group, where the wrestler at the center of the injury rumor not only confirmed it, but gave a shout out to my second newsletter. While it validated me and my information, it still didn't shut the other guy up. Finally, a break. While the guy used an alias for his newsletter, he did actually mention his name a couple of times, and where in the US he attended university. Using this information, I was able to get a friend in the US to do some searching for me, attended that very same university, and discovered that the guy had actually completed a journalism degree several years earlier. Further research indicated that he was now working as a reporter for a regional newspaper in the US. His wrestling newsletter must just be a hobby. So I decided to send all of the information I had, his smear campaign etc., to the newspaper office. I don't know what, if anything, it would do, but it was worth a shot. About a month later, I got an email back from the newspaper, thanking me for the information. They discovered that he was using the newspaper system to run the wrestling newsletter, which was against their policy, so they fired him. And because the newspaper was part of a chain of regional newspapers across the US, he was going to struggle to find another journalism job. The newsletter got shut down as well, because without the newspaper system to run it, the guy had no way of continuing with the newsletter. Side note, I ended up finishing with my newsletters not long after anyway. The first newsletter, as I was just a writer for it, I finished up with it when the owner of the newsletter decided to close it down. He didn't have the time to devote to it due to work commitments. The second one, I started off as just a writer/contributor, then took over their competitions, then eventually took over the whole newsletter. Original owner didn't want to do it anymore. But in the end, I was finishing up at university. I had to move on with my career, so I closed it down. Second story. Jackass manager gets his comeuppance. Entirely too many years ago, I started to work at a fast food company. Let's call it Southern State Not Baked Poultry. Southern State Not Baked Poultry wasn't a bad first job. I was 16, and the assistant manager at that location was my best friend's stepdad, so we took what was tedious and menial and tried to make it fun. He was actually a really good manager and genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. We would do silly stuff before the store opened. While we were doing prep, he would have music playing loudly from his office. As long as everything got done and done well, he really didn't care if we had fun doing it. We'll call him Larry. This story is not about him though. This story is about our store manager. We'll call him Tim. Tim was the exact opposite of our assistant manager. Everything had to be taken seriously. Fun was outlawed. I genuinely hated working with Tim. Tim was an egocentric, power-hungry, petty little man with delusions of grandeur because he was a manager for Southern State Not Baked Poultry. Tim's approach to managing was to work the employee until they burned out. When they did, fire them and hire someone else. Needless to say, morale when Tim worked was in the garbage. Tim hated that crews would prefer working with Larry instead of him. He hated that crews had fun when Larry was working. He hated that our store's numbers were always better when Larry worked. Mostly, he just hated everyone. But one thing that he absolutely hated was a silly little thing Larry did. If it was before the restaurant opened, he would stick his tongue between his teeth and lower lip and shout out a hi name to whichever employee had just walked in. It sounded absolutely ridiculous. I would always do the same thing back, which ended up sounding something like, hi, WAWWY. A perfect example of what an ass Tim was is this. There was a young woman who, due to a variety of stressors, attempted to commit suicide after a particularly grueling shift working with Tim. After she had recovered, she came back for her last paycheck, and Larry was working. Not a coincidence. She called the store to find out what day he was working. So Larry sat her down out in the lobby, bought her lunch, brought her last check out, and sat and talked with her for about an hour. It was after the lunch rush, and he had the time. So he made sure she was doing okay now, talked about whatever she wanted to talk about. By the time she left, she was smiling, but had tears on her cheeks. She had never had someone just sit and listen and let her talk out everything that was going on. Well, the next day Tim had come in and hauled Larry into the office. His words, and I can quote them exactly, because the office was a tiny little cube with no ceiling, just a place to stash paperwork and a computer, were, the next time the suicide queen comes in, tell her to do it right next time. So now you have a clear picture of exactly how petty and vindictive this little man was. Here is where the revenge starts. We were scheduled to have the regional and national bigwigs for Southern State Not Baked Poultry come through our area for an annual inspection. Tim had his eyes set on being one of those bigwigs, at least for the region. Why wouldn't he be? He did everything by the book. That automatically made him a good manager, at least in his eyes. Everything had a checklist, and a procedure, and a set of written instructions in the book, and if you couldn't meet the expectations set forth in the book, well, Tim would yell at you and berate you. Because that's how manager manages, you see. Well, before the bigwigs got to our store, we knew what day they would be coming. Several of us had agreed that on the day they came through, we would all screw up just enough to get Tim to blow his cool. Because our regional manager and the national bigwigs all believed that Southern State Not Baked Poultry was a family company and that employees were valuable team members. The day in question arrived, and the bigwigs were there for their big tour. Whoops, one of the fryers hadn't had the oil replaced last night. Oh look, the shaker table hadn't been cleaned. Done it, we've got way too much coleslaw made up, and we won't get through it before we have to toss it. Crap, we don't have enough chicken poultry in the cooker to fulfill the lunch rush. Man, someone forgot to preheat the second cooker. You get the picture. After the second time I took a minute too long to get a basket of chicken poultry into the cooker. Tim absolutely lost his shit, yelling, cursing, throwing things. He actually physically pushed me away from the breading station in the middle of the lunch rush, while the regional manager and several bigwigs from national stood there, while we had a line several people deep at both cash registers, and a lobby full of people eating. Tim stood there, gulping like a fish. His mouth was moving, like he was trying to say something, but no sounds were coming out. The room was absolutely quiet other than the beeping of a fryer that was done. I looked at Tim. This was the moment we had all been gearing up for. I looked down at where he had pushed me, a set of handprints in flour on my chest, and I cut loose into him. Yelled at him that I quit, took off my apron, and threw it at him. Told him I was tired of his abuse, of his poor management, of how he single-handedly drove moral through the floor every time he walked through the doors. How he was a crappy excuse for a manager, and that if he didn't have Larry and a couple of good shift leads, he'd have driven the location out of business a long time ago. All the color drained from his face, and he bolted to the office cube. The national and regional folks ended up comping everyone's meals that were in the restaurant. Interestingly enough, Tim was not fired, but he was demoted to assistant manager. Larry was promoted to manager. About 10 years later, I was working at my current job as an EMT. We had just dropped a patient off at the hospital that was across the street from the same restaurant, and my partner was hungry, so we drove across the street and pulled in. Now, I hadn't set foot in that restaurant since the day I had quit, but lo and behold, who is working the counter but Tim himself, and his NAMA tag still shows assistant manager. The restaurant was empty since it was between lunch and dinner time, and I just couldn't help myself. I stuck my tongue between my teeth and lower lip, and as loud as I could, shouted out, "Hi, Twim." Haven't been back there since, but that was around 12 years ago. I'm willing to bet he's still just the assistant manager there.